Okay, shalom everyone. Boker Tov. We continue with our introduction to halachic literature. And today, I hope we will finish the story of Akavya ben Mahalalel. This will be the second part of the discussion of Akavya ben Mahalalel. So last week, we looked at Masechet Adayot, chapter 5, Mishnah 6, where we read that Akavya ben Mahalalel testified concerning four things and that were not in accordance with the rabbis, and they told him to retract them, and then they will appoint him a bedin. And his response was, "I would rather be a fool and not a wicked person." And that wickedness could be understood either that he retracted his opinion in order to receive a position of power, or that he felt that following their opinion would be wickedness. There is a debate in the Mishnah whether he was excommunicated or not. Rabbi says he was not excommunicated. It was a different case of a different person, which bears no similarity to by name or the issue that he was arguing with the rabbis for. And finally, in Mishnah 7, we read that Akavya told his son to not follow his way, to listen to the majority. And his son asked him, why are you telling me to do that if you yourself adhered to your ruling? And his father said, I heard from the many, you heard from me. Well, I'm an individual, so you have to follow the majority. I commented last week that it seems that the reason Akavya insisted on his opinions in the beginning was that he knew the Shemua, he heard from his masters, and he felt that this is what the other scholars are doing. They are erasing the heritage by their insistence on following their opinion. So he wanted to try to maintain that legacy to keep it from being completely obliterated. But when he was nearing his death, he realized it didn't work anyway. And he said to his son, it's better not to be in mahloket, not to be alienated from the rabbis, accept their opinion. There's nothing from, meaning now you have to work with the system. He tried to work against the system because he thought he might have a chance. But now it was realistic. He said it's not going to work. So just join forces with them, and for the well-being, for the sake of the Jewish people. Then we also looked at the discussion of Zaken Mamre, the rebellious elder, based on the text of Devarim 17. And we spoke about the fact that, or the idea that what we find in the Torah is not really supporting the way the rabbis interpreted the case. The case, the way it is reporting the Torah, is of two litigants or a decision made in Bedin. They can determine what to do, and they have to go to the central court in Yerushalayim or in the place chosen by Hashem to determine the halacha for them, and they must obey the Bedin. And the punishment for those who disobey is severe. It's execution. Why? Because the Torah sees the importance of maintaining the rule of law. If individual will decide not to obey the law, then there will be chaos. The rabbis took in a different direction. They said that it doesn't talk about litigants or about individuals, but rather about a judge, an elder, who disagrees with the other judges, and eventually their disagreement is brought to the Supreme Court in Yerushalayim. And if that rebellious elder insists of adhering to his opinion, he's going to be executed. And we'll see later on in the Gemara what exactly defines opposition. Is it if he teaches others, if he follows it himself? There's a lot of confusion there. Now, before we go to this Gemara, what we just saw was in Masechet Adayot, which is in the order of Nezikin, of damages. It was Adayot 5, 6, and 7. Now, we'll review briefly what Akavya says in Pirkei Avot. and with the comment that I think Abigail mentioned last week about his statement here. Akavya ben Mahalalel says, you have to observe or reflect on three things, and it will, if you do that, you will not sin. What are they? Know from where you come, where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give an account and reckoning. And that is a famous statement that is found in many synagogues. דע לפני מי אתה עומד, או דע לפני מי אתה עתיד דין וחשבון. The Mishnah expands on it and says, Me'ayin bata, where do you come from? From a putrid drop. Where are you going? To a place of dust, worm of maggots, and before whom you are destined to give an account and reckoning, before Melech Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But as I said, we commented last week that and I think, as I said, correct me if I'm wrong, that Abigail said that, or Daphna, that the second part of the Mishnah is not part of what Akavya ben Mahalalel said. That is a later generation or later scholar that expanded on his original statement, and his original statement is in line with his statement in Masechet Adayot when he said they asked him to retract his rulings, and he said, I will not do it, and I will not be a wicked person in front of God, meaning that he was constantly aware of his responsibility vis-a-vis God, the Torah, and the way the Torah affects the community. So when he says you should know where you come from and where you're going to, that refers to his tradition. He says, I know the tradition that I have received. I know that I am in a leadership position and I have to do the right thing, and I know that I have to report to God. Later on, it was taken out of context, and it was turned into a statement that speaks of one's insignificance and the fact that we're going to report to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So to tell us you have to be extremely careful with everything you do because you are such an insignificant person, yet God is going to demand answers from you. So that's just a review of what we did last week, and we spoke about the dispute of Akavya ben Mahalalel, of the rebellious elder, and of his statement in Pirkei Avot. Now let's look at the two other places where he is mentioned in the Mishnah. One is in Masechet Bechorot, which deals with the firstborn of the animal. This is Bechorot, chapter 3, Mishnah Daled. It's chapter 3, Mishnah. It is Mishnah Daled. Let me go there. Okay, they talk about an obscure and probably not very common situation. What do you do with the hair of a blemished firstborn that was shed from the animal, and then you put it for safekeeping, and then the animal was slaughtered? Could you use it or not? Doesn't really matter what is the background of that. The interesting is the thing here is the way the dispute is going on. So here is the case. The hair of the firstborn. Akavya ben Mahalalel matir, v'Hachamim osri. So Akavya ben Mahalalel says you could use it. Hachamim, the other scholars say you cannot use it. Now, those are divrei Rabbi Yehuda. It's only Rabbi Yehuda who holds like that. But Rabbi Yosei disagrees with him. Amar Rabbi Yosei, לא בזה התיר עקביה, אלא בשיער בכור בעל מום, שנשר והניחו בחלון ואחר כך מת. The case was that this firstborn who shed his hair and that person put it for safekeeping died later on. It wasn't slaughtered, it died, natural death. And on that case, בזה עקביה בן מהלל מתיר ואחרים מוסרים. Regarding that case, עקביה בן מהלל deems that it is permitted to use it, and Hachamim say that it's asur. So that's just interesting that first they care about what Akavya ben Mahalalel said, even though according to some it was excommunicated. And second, they don't know, just in general, they don't know what was the case regarding which the rabbis disagreed. So that's in general casts a shadow of our understanding of tradition, that people know exactly what their master said. Here you have a situation where they are not sure of what was the original case regarding which they were in dispute. So, but also they don't remember what Akavya ben Mahalalel said. So just I want just to comment on that. And then in Mishnah Negaim, chapter 5, Mishnah 3, find another interesting reference to the words of Akavya ben Mahalalel. They talk about Se'ar Pekuda, a certain type of hair called deposited hair, and which they explain in the Mishnah, that has to do with a certain kind of leprosy. So they explain Ezu Se'ar Pekuda, what is considered deposited hair, and they explain it. And then Akavya ben Mahalalel metameh, v'chachamim metaharim. Akavya ben Mahalalel says it's impure. The rabbi said it is pure. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva comments here, I agree with the rabbis that this kind of hair is tahor, but Se'ar Pekuda, the deposited hair, is a different type of hair. And he says what he says. Now, meaning he says your dispute is not about that type of hair, it's about that type of hair. And regarding that type of hair, I disagree with you. Akiva, interesting, is it has the same name as Akavya, same letters, same root. And he disagrees with the rabbis, and their response is Amrulo keshem shebitlu et divrei Akavya av dvarecha enam mekuyamin. Just as we rejected the ruling of Akavya, so there is no validity to your ruling. So again, this is just, I was saying, an interesting phrasing in the Mishnah. First, they tell him, they don't argue with him. They just say, just as we don't listen to Akavya, we don't listen to you. Sort of, we can override you no matter what. We don't need a logical argument. The other thing is that in Hebrew, enan mekuyamim, dvarecha enan mekuyamim, lekayem is not only, as we are used to the word lekayem mitzvot, but also lekayem shmu'ah, to validate an oral transmission. So they tell him, we don't trust that what you've learned has any validity. Okay, so we saw that there are not that many instances in the Mishnah where Akavya ben Mahalalel is mentioned, and in the few places where he is mentioned, there is a dispute, there's an ambiguity about what exactly he said. So almost creating here a mythical character. So now we go to Daf Peihet Amud Aleph, page 88a of Sanhedrin. The Mishnah, the Talmud here continues expounds of the Mishnah that we've reviewed last week, that describes the procedure for Zaken Mamre, for how to define a rebellious elder. And at one point, the Mishnah says that there were 3 Batei Dinim, 3 courts in Yerushalayim, and they would go to one court after another until they come to the Supreme Court. It's called Bedin Gadol, that sits in Lishkat HaGazit. They had a special office made of hewn stones in the temple. So now the Talmud tries to define what exactly is the nature of the dispute between the rebellious elder and the sages and the other scholars, right? Which, as I like to comment always, we have to think of the chronology and of what was not asked or what was not said before. Rav Kahana is the third generation Amora, 4th century maybe, who is now trying to explain the Mishnah that was in the 2nd century. And for about 200 years, nobody explained exactly what is the nature of the discussion, of the dispute between the rebellious elder and the rest of the Sanhedrin. Why was it not defined clearly in the legislation of the Mishnah? And where are the cases? Was there ever any case like that? So, as I said, the Mishnah teaches there were 3 courts in Yerushalayim, and we said how they have to go from one court to another. Rav Kahana says, if the rebellious elder says his ruling on the basis of tradition that he received from his teacher, and they say that what they say is the basis of tradition, the rebellious elder is not executed. In Hebrew, Amar Rav Kahana, hu omer mipi hashemua, vehen omrim mipi hashemua, eno neherag. Remember that we asked this question when we read the first paragraph that we start with, the Mishnah in Adayot 5:6, where it says, "Arba'a dvarim he'id Akavya ben Mahalalel lifnei Chachamim." He testified regarding 4 things. That means that he had a tradition. So how did they counteract his tradition? Did they have a different tradition? Based on what he says to his son before he dies, he says, "Ani shamati mipi hamerubim ve'hem shamu mipi hamerubim." I heard from the many, and they heard from the many. So that means that there were 2 opposing traditions. Akavya heard one tradition from his many masters, and the rabbis heard a tradition from their many masters. The question is, was there a dispute earlier in time that was based on logic, or where do you get 2 shumuot from? How can you have 2 oral traditions? Is this a dispute that goes all the way back to Har Sinai, just after Moshe came down from the mountain and told people, this is what you do? 2 people heard him, one heard A and one heard B. That's a side question. But in any case, Rav Kahana says that if he says that he heard it mipi hashemua, and they say mipi hashemua eno neherag, הוא אומר, כך הוא בעיניי, והן אומרים, כך הוא בעינינו, אינו נהרג. If he says, this is the correct understanding in my eyes, meaning it's a question of interpretation, and they say, no, this is the right interpretation, he is not executed. וכל שכן הוא אומר מפי השמועה, והן אומרים, כך הוא בעינינו, אינו נהרג. And even more so, meaning if we say that the contradictions between his oral tradition to their oral tradition, or between his interpretation to their interpretation, which means that it's on the same level of authority. Either both are based on oral tradition or both are based on their understanding. And we say that in this case, if that is the level of dispute, he is not executed. Even more so, if he said, I have an oral tradition, and then they say, we don't rely on your oral tradition because we interpret the text differently, if it's obvious that he's not going to be executed because his source of knowledge is greater than their source of knowledge. Ad sheyomar, in order for him to be executed, he must say, Kachu be'inai, v'hen omerim mipi hashemua. So he says, this is my interpretation, and they say, this is what we've heard. Teda, what is the proof that I'm wrong, that I'm right? Sorry, says Rav Kahana, Sharei lo hargu et Akavya ben Mahalalel. Akavya ben Mahalalel was not executed. Why? Because he said that he received the Shemua, an oral tradition, and they said that they had a Shemua. Rabbi Elazar Omer, אפילו הוא אומר מפי השמועה והם אומרים כך הוא בעינינו, נהרג. Rabbi Elazar says, even if the rebellious elder says his ruling on the basis is on the basis of tradition, and the members of the court say this is the correct understanding in our eyes, he is executed. So the rebellious elder says, this is what I've heard from my rabbis. And the other rabbis say, yeah, but we interpret it differently. Which seems a case where he has a higher authority than they have, because he relies on an old tradition that he received from his masters in the previous generation. Rabbi Elazar says, even in this case, that person will be put to death. Lama? Kedei shelo yirbu machalokot v'Yisrael. In order to prevent disputes or discord among Am Yisrael. That is an argument that is used several times by Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel, who, as you recall, was very authoritative, uh, very aggressive in imposing his opinion. And in several cases, he says, even turning to God when his ship was about to be shipwrecked, he felt that it was a punishment for him excommunicating Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkenos for disagreeing with him. Rabban Gamliel said, God, that I didn't do it for my glory or the glory of my family. I did it shelo yirbu machlokot b'Yisrael. So I wanted to avoid dispute and discord. So we see here from this statement of the Talmud by the name of Rabbi Elazar that they're willing to take that idea of unity, uniformity, and one central authority to an extreme, to the point of killing a person, executing a person for disobeying to Bedin. ואם תאמר, מפני מה לא הרגו את עקביה בן מהללאל? מפני שלא הורה הלכה למעשה. If you ask, why was Akavya ben Mahalalel not executed? If you tell me that for any disobedience, even if he has a higher source that he could rely on, such as is the Shemuah, the oral tradition, and they only have their logic to dispute him, and still is going to be executed, right? So why was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah not executed? And his answer is because he did not teach people to follow his opinion as a practical halakha. He just claimed that this is the halakha. A second, I'm trying to get already in the picture. Yeah. Okay. So first is a question of the validity of oral tradition. This is a serious issue. We're talking about capital punishment. And there's a dispute between Rabbi Elazar and the other scholars of when this capital punishment is issued as a verdict. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Elazar, even if the source of authority of the rebellious elder is greater than that of the sages, meaning that he relies on oral tradition and they rely on logic, and according to the sages, only if his source of authority is lesser than that of the rabbis, of the majority. And that is not a simple issue. Where was the tradition lost when you talk about something like that? When you bring someone to court, it says, okay, we might execute him or not. Depends on what we remember that the Torah said. At what point in time was the tradition breached to the extent that we don't know what to do with this rebellious elder? But in any case, this is what the Gemara says. We have two opinions in the Talmud. According to one opinion, if the source of authority of the rebellious elder and the other side is equal, or if his source is lesser than that of the majority, he's not being executed. Only if it's equal, he is not executed. If his source is higher, meaning oral tradition, he is spared. Only if his source of contradiction is lesser than theirs, he will be executed. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, in all cases, that scholar, that rebellious elder, will be put to death, whether his source of authority is equal to theirs or even higher than theirs. It will always be executed, because the goal here is not to establish who is right and who is wrong, but rather to establish law and order. That is a sort of an extreme position here. But the commentators are still not satisfied with what was in the Gemara. There are still complications. So we're going to look now at some of the Mefarshim on that. So I put together just two. Okay. the read Rabbi Yeshaya Ditrani from the early medieval times says on the Talmud here, לא מצינו יחיד חולק עם רבים בימי הבית אלא זה. בחלוקות בית שמאי ובית הלל רבים ורבים היו. ולאחר החורבן היו אותם התנאים שחלקו עם רבים. That's just a comment that it's hard really to corroborate. He says that the only mahloka, the only dispute that we find from the time of the temple between an individual and the majority is the dispute of Akavya ben Mahalalel. And that the disputes of Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel was always the majority versus the majority. And all these Tanaim, all these individuals who disagreed with the majority lived after the destruction. So he says basically that this is an exceptional case. There was only one time that there was one person who had a dispute with the many. That's his commentary on that story. We don't know that it is true. We know that there were many disputes between Shammai and Hillel, and between the students of Shammai and students of Hillel, but we don't always know how many people were in each side. And also, the question is the rebellious elder a law that is limited only to one person? What if the minority decides to follow their rule and against the majority? The author of Yad David, which is the book by Rabbi Yosef David Zinsheim of Germany of the 18th century, says the following: תדע שהרי לא הרגו את עקביה וכתב רש"י. So this is I'll read and translate. He quotes the Gemara that says, תדע שלא הרגו את עקביה. I mean, you should know that what we're saying is true, that if his source of authority is higher than that of the other scholars, he's not executed. So תדע, from here we learn that. וכתב רש"י שנחלק על החכמים בלשכת הגזית בארבעה דברים. עיין שם. So Rashi comments that Akavya ben Mahalalel disagreed with the scholars who sat in that Lishkat HaGazit, in that office of hewn stones, which was the location of the Sanhedrin. He disagreed with them on 4 issues. ואם כן, כיוון שנחלק על בית דין הגדול, ודאי היה לו דין זקן ממרה. So since he disagreed with the great Beit Din, he is definitely a rebellious elder. אלא ודאי, כיוון דמפי השמועה היה, לא היה נעשה זקן ממרה. So why was he not considered a rebellious elder? Because he relied on oral tradition. וצריך לומר לשיטה זו, לעקביה הורה לעשות כדבריו. So if we follow that line of thought, we must say that Akiva did teach other people, did rule for others to follow him, right? Because Rabbi Elazar is the one who acquits Akavya, because Akavya did not rule for others. So it must be that the first opinion says that he did. Even though he was strict regarding 3 issues and lenient regarding the 4th, however, he is considered a rebellious elder for being lenient. And even the 3 with on which he was strict, this stringency is not enough, because it could lead to a leniency in another place. So I want to dwell 1 second on this issue. Go back to the idea of Humra and Kula. So I'm going back to the Mishnah in Adayot. I want us to look at the issues that he disagreed on the rabbis with. So this is Mishnah Adayot, chapter 5. עקביה במעל העיד 4 דברים. So over there, מטמא, הוא היה מטמא, שיער הפקודה ודם הירוק. He said that those two things are impure. He allowed to use the hair of the Bechor, as we read, and he said that you do not let a convert or a maidservant sent free to drink the water of Sotah, the water of the deviated woman. So how do you use the yardstick of Humra V'Kula? Because this commentator goes into the question now that was not mentioned in earlier sources regarding the nature of the dispute. Up until now, and maybe there are others who say that, but he's the one who highlights it. We didn't find a distinction between leniency and stringency to say the rebellious elder is punished only if he's more lenient than the great bedin. But Rabbi Zinsheim says yes, it has to do with that. So he thinks that those are three to make this type of hair and this type of blood impure is considered a stringency, and the fact that you don't let a woman who's a convert to drink the water of Sotah a stringency, and his leniency is that he allows to use the hair of the Bechor. So let's just look at those two examples, those two first cases of him declaring that blood to be pure or impure, right? The rabbi say it's impure, and the rabbi say it's pure, and he says it's impure, right? So Rabbi Zinsheim considers that to be Humra versus Kula. He is a Mahmir, and they're Mekel. And the Tosafot say that's Humra de'ateh lidei Kula. So let us dwell on this for a second. This is something that I've discussed in other classes. It's important. It keeps coming up. What is the definition of being strict and being lenient? So Rabbi Zinsheim in this book, Yad David, says, even though he was more strict than the rabbis, still they consider him a rebel because there was one issue in which he was more lenient, right? But let's look at this for a second and ask the question if you could call it objectively lenient or strict. There's a certain they disagree regarding a certain type of blood and a certain type of hair, whether it's pure or impure, right? Now let's say that there is an absolute truth. That according to the truth, it's either pure or impure, right? If the truth is as the rabbis say, that the blood is pure, and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah Akavya ben Mahalalel decides that it's impure, right? Rabbi Zinsheim called it being strict. Even though it's pure, he is going to go with the stringency and say, let's deal with it as something that's impure. Why is it a stringency? How many things, everything is now going to be affected by that. If it says that the blood is impure, right? If it touched food, that food will be thrown away. If someone touched that blood and went into the temple, that person will be punished. If we talk about blood that is related to sexual relationship, a woman might not be, a man and a woman may not be allowed to be together to have sexual relationships, and that might prevent them from having children. Maybe that was the time that they could have it. So that idea that it's okay to disagree with the majority if you're strict, but not if you're lenient, has no basis. And I think that this is a later development in our halachic thinking. It's like I said, it's an author from the 18th century, but he wants to draw a distinction between disagreeing with the majority on in being lenient or being strict. But as I showed here, everything can be either strict or lenient, depends on which angle you look at it. And the early sources did not make this distinction. ולמאן דאמר שלא הורה, here a word is missing, should be שלא הורה הלכה למעשה. So this is if we say that he actually told people rules for people to follow his teachings. Now, if we say that he didn't, לפי מה שכתב הר"ן בשם הרמב"ם, as רבנו ניסים wrote in the name of Maimonides, אפילו להחמיר על עצמו, he says, according to רבנו ניסים, even if you want to be strict for yourself, you could only do it before the argument became public. קודם שירצה דבריו לפניהם. ולאחר שיצא דבריו לפניהם וביטלו דבריו שהם מתירים מהעניין ההוא, אסור לו לנהוג איסור בעצמו. But once he spoke in front of the other rabbis and they overruled him and they say it is permissible, he's not allowed to deal with it as forbidden. So according to that, we must say, דאפילו לעצמו לא הורה עקביה, ורק לאחרים, ורק לימד כן, או למד כן, ולכן היה פטור. That even, he didn't even follow his own ruling, he just said that this is the true interpretation, but he did something different. ומה שאמר לבנו, חזור בך בארבעה דברים שהיית אומר, if that is the case, then what is he telling his son? Retract your opinion. He says, don't even teach it, don't even learn it, just to think differently. Okay, so we see that this commentator gets entangled trying to figure out what exactly is happening between Akavya and the rabbis. ויש לדקדק, but now he has a question against the Talmud. ויש לדקדק על הגמרא. There's a question that we should ask on the Talmud. What is it? דראיות עקביה אינן אלא בהוא אמר מפי השמועה ואין אומרים מפי השמועה. All we can prove from the story of Akavya is that in the case that he relies on oral tradition and they rely on oral tradition, he is spared. אבל בהוא אומר כך הוא בעיניי ואין אומרים כך הוא בעינינו, מנהלן דאינו נהרג. What if the both of them say, this is our interpretation? ואפשר לומר, you understand, the question is like, if I'll clarify the question. What he asks is this. The Talmud said this. Eno ne'erag, he is only executed עד שאומר כך הוא בעיניי והם אומרים פי השמועה. Only if he relies on his own interpretation and they rely on tradition, which has a higher authority, he is going to be executed. תדע שהרי לא הרגו את עקביה בן מהללאל. What is the proof that Akavya ben Mahalalel was not killed? So it brings us back to the question that I mentioned before. How is it possible that there is confusion regarding such a crucial case? What do you do when there is a dispute between the judges, and not only it's a crucial situation, the punishment is extremely severe. It's not irreversible death, and they don't know what to do, and they rely on an incident, on a precedent. There was a case of a debate, and according to the Tosfot Arid, Rabbi Shaya Ditrani, was only one case like that. There was one case of a debate between the individual and the majority, and in this case, that individual was not executed. What was the type of their dispute? The individual Akavya relied on his tradition, the majority relied on tradition, and he was not killed. Asks Rabbi Zinsheim, so you only have a proof to this type of dispute, but what if the dispute was between one who relies on his interpretation versus many who rely on their interpretation? This is not written. So what do we do? So let's return to Rabbi Zinsheim in his statement. אפשר לומר, דוודאי כיוון שלא יוכלו להכריע הדבר מפי השמועה, עמדו למניין להכריע הדבר בשיקול דעתם. So he says we must say that since they were not able to determine the halacha based on their tradition, they voted on it. And when they voted on it, he was an individual. והוא היה אומר, אפילו לולא קבלתו, and he said, even if I had not received it by tradition, כך היה נראה בעיניי. I would logically argue that this is the case. והם היו אומרים, כך הוא נראה בעינינו, ואפילו אחי לא נעשה זקן אמרה. And even though, now, Rabbi Zinsheim, because of his kushia, because of his question, creates a new reality and a new situation that's not mentioned in the Mishnah, one in which they argue, each one of them supports his argument by with his oral tradition. They cannot reach a conclusion, and therefore they say, okay, let us vote. When they vote, Akavya says, I still hold by my opinion because it's my opinion, it's my interpretation. I'm not relying on Shemua, or I don't have to rely on Shemua anymore. And they say, this is our interpretation, and still he was not executed. That's how the Gemara proves its argument, its statement that for him to be executed, he has to rely on a lesser authority. So he raises one more question. ואם כן, כל זקן יפתור עצמו בזה, ויאמר מליבו שהוא מפי השמועה. It says, any rebellious elder could exempt himself from punishment by saying, that's what I heard. What I feel that happens here is that, with time, this issue became a central, or you could say not as central, I would say more like an ossified concept, a frozen concept that you just cannot argue with the majority. And then Rabbi Zinsheim goes on to interpret it based on his perspective from a much, much later period, almost the beginning of what we call the modern era. And he speaks about markers of stringency and leniency. And he also says, how can we trust that this elder is saying the truth? This is the question of integrity. For him to raise it to say maybe he's lying, that I don't think have ever occurred to the sages of the Talmud. They say, we know Akavya ben Mahalalel says that this is his tradition, and we believe him. He says, how do we know that he's saying the truth? Maybe he's just trying to support his. If this is our thought process, then we really have a problem. In any case, there's no clear conclusion here with in my opinion, in the discussion of Rabbi Zinsheim. But what we do see is that we have a Mishnah discussion of the judicial process. To sum up what we've had, as it is brought in the context of Akavya ben Mahalalel, in the Torah, we have no source in the Pshat for that process as the rabbis describe it. There's what the Torah speaks about is a dispute between litigants or a discussion in Bedin, which is determined by majority. The rabbis created the scenario of Zaken Mamre, of a rebellious elder that disagrees with the majority and insists on his opinion and teaches others to do the same, thus creating a rift in the nation, and that's why he has to be executed. But when they discuss the case of Akavya ben Mahalalel, we cannot reach an agreement of what exactly was the type of their discussion, what was the level of authority that each one of them relied on, and why was he not executed. So to conclude, this is, I think with that we'll conclude our discussion of the development of halachic literature at the time of the Mishnah. And that next we will move to the Talmud, 1 second. Yeah, and next we'll move to the Talmud. There is much more to study in the Mishnah, and that was, I think, we did. I remember 4 or 5 classes on the Mishnah. It's just an appetizer. It's just an invitation to read the Mishnah with new eyes, to ask those questions of when is it happening, who is talking to one another, what is the source of their authority, how is it possible that in the 2nd century we still don't know what is the definition of a mamzer, of someone whose lineage is unclear. How come that in the 2nd century we're not sure what is the exact halacha in some issues of Shabbat or impurity? It's hard to accept the opinion that everything comes in tradition. There was never a disruption in that chain. So with that, before we go to question, I said with that we conclude our discussion of the period of the Mishnah, and from here we'll segue into the Talmud. We'll start the discussion of Talmud B'ezrat Hashem next week.